Sometimes communication scholars can sound like meteorologists. We talk about hot climates or cold climates or chilly climates. I'm not a meteorologist. I don't even play one on TV. But in today's lecture, we're going to take a look at what those words mean and how they apply to our relationships.
I have people skills. I am good at dealing with people.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
Okay, I'm not a weatherman, but I can give the forecast for an interpersonal relationship, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Communication climates are kind of funky beasts. We can talk about them in academic terms, and I'm going to share some of those terms in this lecture, but we can also talk about them in more practical terms. There are some relationships that we have that are hot, that are like a desert, that's scorching, where we feel oppressed, we feel like we're getting beaten up all the time, we feel like we're always fighting. But then there are other relationships that are cold, that are frigid, like you're in Antarctica or something, and you don't feel like you can even talk to the other person. It's just frozen. But then there are times where the relationship is nice and warm, like a beach in paradise. It's wonderful, it's comfortable. And there are other times where it's comfy like a living room. These are all different ways that we can look at relationships. And by the end of this lecture, you should be able to describe and define what interpersonal climates are. You should also be able to explain how our interpersonal choices affect those climates. And finally, we should be able to identify some specific strategies for effecting change in our more uncomfortable climates. Is it too hot where you live? Let's figure out how to fix it. First, we need to start by understanding what communication climates are. Let's start with that. Like I said, we can use weather terms to describe climates. We can talk about a stormy climate. We can talk about a hot climate. We can talk about a cold climate. We can talk about a chilly climate or an icy climate. There are all sorts of words that we can use that are just like the terms that we use to predict the weather. But that's not necessarily clear on what exactly a communication climate is. The academic way that we can look at climates is to define it as the emotional tone in the relationship. And that's a pretty academic way of looking at things, but there's another way that we can look at it. We can also look at it as the value that we feel the other person places on us. That's the more practical way of saying the emotional tone. There's this sense that we are connected to the other person. How is that connection existing? Does that connection exist with things that make us feel good about ourselves and about the relationship, or is it more challenging? So now we understand what communication climates are. Let's figure out how we create them, how the academic words that we use to define them. Instead of using words like hot or cold or chilly, we use 3 specific words. We can talk about disconfirming climates, we can talk about disagreeing climates, and we can talk about confirming climates. Each of these are very important in how we understand relationships and how we interact with the other people. And all of these are related to our choices. Let's start first by taking a look at disconfirming climates. Disconfirming climates are those climates where we don't feel validated at all. In other words, we don't feel like we exist. The most damaging way that we can communicate with another person is to deny their existence. We call them impervious responses. I say something, you say nothing. Not only do you not say anything, you don't even acknowledge that I made a statement. It's the most harmful method of communication. It's the most harmful response in an interpersonal relationship. And that is what creates a disconfirming climate. A sense that I don't exist. I'm not here. But we can take it up a step. We can go from disagreeing or disconfirming the other person, and we can recognize, yep, you're there. I know you're there. But I don't agree with you. Not only do I not agree with you, I don't feel that your position has any relevance or is valid. So in a disconfirming climate, we don't acknowledge the other person's existence. But once we move up a little bit, we come into a disagreeing climate. I know you're there, but you're wrong. Whatever you have to say, it's wrong. And I'm just going to tell you, you're wrong. That's a disagreeing climate. And it's slightly less hurtful than a disconfirming climate, because at least we recognize that the other person knows we're there. On the other side of it, though, it's hard to fight for ourselves in those relationships. We constantly feel like we're fighting just to be recognized. Our perceptions are rejected. The other person doesn't seem to communicate that they recognize that we have different perceptions or different perspectives. And then, once we've gotten past that, we can get into the confirming climate. This is where not only is our existence confirmed, but our opinions are validated. It doesn't mean that your opinion is always right, and it doesn't mean that the other person always wholly accepts your opinion. But it does mean that you feel like your opinion is heard. Your voice is heard. And that's what makes a confirming climate so important and so valuable. If we can develop our relationships to be more confirming, we start giving other people the sense that they exist and the sense that they have a contribution to make to our society, to our relationship. We can describe human relationships in these three different ways. We can talk about relationships where you are not validated to even exist. You can talk about relationships where I know you exist, but you don't have anything to contribute. Or we can talk about relationships where I know you exist and I recognize and validate your contributions. Notice that in each of these, the actions that we take actually affect how that relationship is perceived. So if I don't respond to something you say, I don't validate your existence. But if I respond to everything you say by rejecting it, that creates a disagreeing climate where I'm not willing to accept that you are ever even right. If, on the other hand, I recognize your existence and I enter into a conversation with you about where we disagree and why we disagree, then we start to create this confirming climate where both of us have the sense that we are a valuable and a vital part of the relationship. And that's what's most important about communication climates. Now let's think about some strategies. How do we deal with communication climates? How do our actions make things better? Well, communication climates work in spirals. And we're going to take a look at two different spirals. First, escalatory spirals. First, affirming spirals, and second are conflict spirals. When I first got married, my wife's friend gave her a book that told us how to make our marriage happy. I read through it. It was kind of a lame book, but there was one thing in it that caught my eye because it confirmed everything that I had been learning in school, everything that I had been experiencing in my own life, and it's this. Our relationships work in spirals. If you ask me to do something, and I tell you that I'm not really interested in doing it, then the next time I ask you to do something, you're a little bit more likely not to do it. Which then makes it even less likely that I'm going to help you out. And it makes it even less likely that you are going to help me out. We call this a rejecting spiral, or a spiral of rejection. That when I say no, when I reject you, you will in turn reject me. Likewise, it actually works the same way. If I ask you to do something, or if you ask me to do something, and I really don't want to do it, but I value our relationship and I do it anyway, my wife comes home and I'm in the middle of cooking dinner and she says, "Hey honey, can you change our kid?" I don't really want to stop cooking dinner, wash my hands, go pick up the baby, change the baby, wash my hands, go back to cooking dinner. But if I say yes, then it creates a positive atmosphere and it starts this positive spiral where the next time I have a big ask, she's more likely to say yes. And then I'm more likely to say yes. And she's more likely to say yes. And it works in a spiral because we recognize that the other person has been willing to make that contribution and to make that sacrifice. Relationships are typically reciprocal, which means that whatever I do, you do back to me. That's how spirals start. These same spirals, the same concept of a spiral, applies to conflict. When you and the other person in your relationship get into a fight, our fights work in spirals. Specifically, we can look at escalatory spirals or de-escalatory spirals in conflict. Conflict spirals work by escalating or de-escalating. And an escalatory spiral is when we are constantly trying to top each other. I yell at you, you yell at me louder. I yell at you louder, you yell at me louder, and finally we're screaming at each other and we don't get anywhere. We have allowed the conflict to escalate, and we are constantly trying to top each other. Dale Carnegie would always say the best way to win an argument is to avoid it in the first place. So here's how a de-escalatory spiral works. As soon as you recognize that you and your partner are starting to argue or have found conflict, the second you recognize that there is an argument brewing, 2 words. You're right. Now, I know that this is hard for a lot of people because a lot of people have a hard time saying those words to another person. I am not suggesting you say, "You're right and I'm wrong." Simply by saying, "You're right," you are affirming the other person's perspective. Now, think back to those different ways that we can categorize relationships. If I yell at you and tell you, "Yep, you're there, but I disagree with you," that's a disagreeing climate. If I instead say, "You're right," what I'm doing is saying, "You are there, and I recognize your contribution to this relationship." Now let's figure out where we find that disagreement. Where does that disagreement start? And let's work from there. That's the challenge to resolving conflict, and that's how we resolve conflicts. If we can start that de-escalatory spiral, power given up is power shared. If I'm willing to give up that power, you are more likely to be also willing to give up the power that you've maintained in the conflict. Now, it doesn't always work on the first try. And if you've built up a lot of animus in the relationship, it's going to take a little while for those habits to kick in. But as soon as you start using those methods, once you start de-escalating the relationship immediately, what you'll find is that the conflicts get a little less loud and a little more easy to deal with. And that's it. You should be able to define and describe communication climates, explain how our choices affect those climates, and identify strategies to change how we see our communication climates. These are important concepts in our relationships, and it's an important part of who we are as people, and it's a vital part of the experience we have in the world around us. That's all I got for you, and I'll see you on the flip side.